This man that we met last week in chapter 1, right, and his attitude, that's the guy we're dealing with now, where he is in his mind. And so with that in mind, we come to this account, and I have detailed this all the way through verse 18. And I want us to go ahead and read the whole of it again, but I want us to show how it's kind of organized. That remember what we have is the exposition is where all the pertinent information has to get out. The question mark of where the tension really begins, that's rising action. How things are ultimately decided in the story is your climax. What follows as a result of the climax of whatever decision or action was taken, what follows from that happens then, and then you get a hint of how the author expects you to feel about all of this, or how they were feeling. So let's note that as we go through the text. After these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, he remembered Vashti, what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel, into the women's quarters, under the custody of Hegai the king's eunuch, custodian of the women. And let beauty preparations be given them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This thing pleased the king, and he did so. In Shushan the citadel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Okay, you notice now that what we've just done is we've now got all the characters in place and all the situations, and we kind of know where this is heading because we've got what they're going to do from the king's side, and now we're introduced with this other character, and we know then the two things that go together with all this is beautiful young woman. Right? So that tells us kind of where we're going, but we haven't seen what's happened yet. So that picks up in verse 8. So it was when the king's commanded decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her besides her allowance. Then 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months' preparation according to the regulations for the women, for thus were the days of their preparation apportioned, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Thus prepared, each young woman went to the king, and she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the women's quarters to the king's palace. In the evening she went, and in the morning she returned to the second house of the women, to the custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and called for her by name. Now when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. That's where we have the date. All right, so now the tension is rising. What's going to happen now? She's selected, and she has to go through all of this, and here's the situation as it exists. So now it's up to her being originally taken all the way to the point of where now it's her turn to go in with the king. That leads us then to the climax of the story. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. That's the decision made. So now what happens as a result of this? So he had set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king, and you could say that this really in 18 as well, then the king made a great feast. Remember I told you feast would be important in Esther? The feast of Esther for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king. All right, so that is the account of where you get and see what's happened with Esther. So as we look at the main characters, as far as how it's laid out by the author, you have Xerxes, who without any question in this story is the lover. He's not the ruler so much as he's the lover here, because it's all set up on the basis of, oh, now he's sorry. He's back from war, and now he's sorry about this. He doesn't have Vashti anymore. Now where's he going to find any kind of consolation? We've got this problem. We've got to do something about it, so we turn to everyone else. Mordecai, as he's introduced, is given a very classic caregiver role. He's the one who is taking care of and is introduced to us as the person who is taking care of this young lady that is his relative. Esther, very important, put into the labeling here, is the orphan. She has neither father or mother. That's specified. So she doesn't have anybody essentially but Mordecai who is caring for her. That is important to understand. She's coming from nothing. No one else can take care of her. He steps in. And then you have Haggai, who is, I say throughout this, is he's operating as a sage, because he is giving advice to Esther that is important for the story about what she is to do, take, the preparations. He's showing all those kind of things for her. He does some caregiver things as well by moving her, but that's the core of what we have here. All right, so now let's go back and take a look then at what was laid out in the first 7 verses. As we went through and looked at it, and since we already read it, I'll move through that. But let's take a look at all the things that actually happened. All of a sudden you get, as he's introduced, moving into chapter 2, is he's had a change of heart. Is that, wait a minute. And again, that's why that timing that you don't really appreciate until you get later on to say, oh, this was actually a while. And that now he's been gone, but now he is back, and things that should have been back to normal in the palace aren't there. So that's a problem. So how do you solve and resolve this problem? Now remember, and I think this is important for you to understand the flow of the way the book is written, this is a self-created problem. Remember that, okay? We've got this serious problem. So who created that? The advisors to the king. So who does he turn to when he's got the new problem that was created by the old problem? To the advisors. Oh, we got to fix this new problem here. Doesn't this remind you of government? But we caused this one problem, so we're going to fix it with the same people. So we come through, and so they propose. They've got this great idea, and that is, we'll throw a beauty pageant. Now, I want you to think about that's really what's going on here. Is we're going to have this contest, and boy, is it going to be! It is an empire-wide beauty contest. We're going to gather everybody up. So all these people are going to go through, and you're going to get the word out. Okay, that's important. Remember, that happened again. You have to go out through the whole large. Remember, we showed you the map. Persia is big. They're going on horses to carry this message throughout the whole empire, and they're going to have a woman roundup. Okay, and we're going to get all the young women. Okay, and that are pretty. We're going to make sure of that. So they're supposed to know what the king's looking for here. So they do that, and they're going to gather them together. I'm not sure exactly, doesn't tell you about how they decided who and how many, but we're going through this. Okay? And they bring them all in. And what we find in verses 4 through 6 now is that there's something else, really 5, that we've got someone else to deal with. Because if all of this is done just to replace Vashti, that's going to affect a lot of people. And so then you get, beginning in verse 5, and this is where it's brought up about Mordecai, because it's important, and you ought to immediately, as you're reading through this, say, he's just been talking about putting together and getting woman, and the first name that's brought up is a man. That immediately should tell you that this is an important figure in the story, because there's no reason for him to show up except his relationship to what's going on above. So that immediately is resolved in verse 7 when it's noted that he had brought up Hadassah, who is Esther. Okay, so he's given charge of her, and the key element as you get to verse 7, though, it's all these main things that you have, okay, that is what moves this story along. King's change of heart, the recommendation for a beauty contest by the leaders. Mordecai has this daughter that's not really his daughter. She's beautiful. All those pieces are in place. Okay? That's what we have for our information. So now we get to what they go through, as we already have read. So that was a lot of reading, wasn't it? So now we get to verse 8, and we see, and remember that rising action is important for moving things through about how is this all going to play out. It essentially is what's going to happen to Esther. If she's beautiful, that's implied, and it's going to start off with is, yep, she's chosen. It's basically foreshadowed in the verse before, she's going to be chosen, she's beautiful. So now we have the tension is she's selected. Now I want you to appreciate this. The problem can come up sometimes when we go through really any story when you've already know the ending, but certainly it's true in the Bible, that we tend to assume from an outlook standpoint that everybody knows the ending. They don't know the ending. They don't know how this is going to turn out. So let's understand what's actually happening. You've got a young woman who is taken from the one person in her family that she has left, plucked up, taken in with a bunch of other women. And from that point forward, there is a chance she will never see him again. I know you don't read it that way, but you need to appreciate it. That all of these women, what the process is they are taken into hut number 1 with all the virgins, and they're going to end up, when the king's done with them, in the room with the harem, as part of the harem. That's what's happened here that we just read, if you didn't realize it. You move from the virgin room to the harem room. So Haggai, who is in charge of all of this operation, specifically as he is in charge of these women who've been brought in, he liked Esther. Now, it doesn't specify why. It implies that there's something different about the way she behaves toward him and treats him. But it's not really ever specified. But she did something that caused him to really like her and therefore help her. Now that's saying something. Remember, we don't know the exact number, but these were women coming from all over the empire. You know, we get ours down to 50. That's just because that's how many states we have. We don't know how many that they got this down to. 127 provinces. I'm not sure how they worked it. So he helped her, and the help was providing extra, anything she needed. We don't know, it gives us an idea of some of what that was, but the beauty preparations of the day, probably some health things, that kind of thing of what they had, she was provided. Now, in verse 10, and this is going to be something I want to emphasize what you see as a literary device that's very important throughout this particular section. In verse 10, it's emphasized she did not tell anybody her ethnicity. Mordecai had told her not to, so she didn't tell anyone she was a Jew. And I said, well, why does that matter? It's going to matter coming up. Okay? And that's what you have with foreshadowing. is all of these things that are being laid out that are actually important are being told to us from the very beginning. So the next thing, if you notice, this is what makes this such good writing. I mean, it's inspired, I understand that, it's history, but it is excellent writing. Did you feel, as I read in verse 11, and you have Mordecai who's had to give up this girl. He's out front, so he's gone as far as he can go with her. That's kind of what's implied. He has traveled and gone as far, we don't know where he started, but here's where he's in the captivity, we know, gone with her as far as he could, but he has to stay outside. And he's there pacing. Now, just by telling you that he's pacing, that is actually a brilliant way to make you get a little bit of feeling the suspense of the moment, isn't it? If you are watching someone and they're just kind of, I mean, y'all are getting tense just watching me, trying to question whether or not I might fall. Good possibility. Okay, so it's building up the tension. You're designed to see that and to feel that problem. Now, through this situation, now in verse 12, the preparations are made for a year. Now, when you begin and you see in verse 1 that the king says, oh, this isn't good. I need a queen. And they pose all this. You kind of thought, well, this needs to kind of, move things along. This takes a year for all of them. Now, this is beauty preparation. What else is going on with why you'd wait a year? We got to make sure of certain things about her before she goes into the king. And 1 year would take care of that timing-wise. She's provided all that they would do. And they had very specific, it's really odd when you read in the ancient world the different kind of things they would do for beauty preparations. We're most familiar maybe with this with Cleopatra, but they were doing these kind of things long before that. And what you would soak in, what you would apply to your skin, all those kind of things. That's what they were doing over time so that you would kind of soak up its essence in a sense. Okay, and that's what they wanted for her. So then you get to verses 13 and 14, and this is where the women take their turns. And this is one of those things that's right here in Scripture, and I think there are a number of people read over this and don't ever think about what they just read. And that they're just going through, and if you're moving from the virgin house to the harem house, and what lies between is a night with the king. And he's just moving through all these girls. Interestingly, Herodotus does note that one of the things that Xerxes did when he got back, having lost the war, was take comfort in his harem. That's from Herodotus. So they take turns. And then you get to 15 and 16, the high point of now, okay, all of this is building. You've got Mordecai out here, and you've got all of this other going on inside with Esther. And Esther's just waiting. Notice, and I want to remind, does she have any choice in any of this? I think we have a hard time understanding what's happened. Is that if you were a beautiful woman in the empire and you were selected, from that point forward, you don't have choices. See, that's why it's important that you have to go back and make sure you're reading it through the lens of that time rather than through today's lens. It's based upon what the Persians how they would have seen their people. They were still essentially a captive people, even though they were allowed to go back and to rebuild. They were a captive people. They were a conquered people. Yes? That Mordecai was what? Wrote? No, we cannot assume that. Well, he doesn't know everything that's going on. That's why his concerns him. To answer the question why I don't think Mordecai wrote this book is that okay, everyone close your ears. We're going to go to the end of the book. At the end of the book, Mordecai is placed in a position of power. Okay, right? And he was closely at that point associated with Xerxes. When Xerxes goes out of power, it is not an easy, shall we say, nice transition of power. It is and anybody with him probably was killed too. And we know that the nature of these were written to remind us of why we are to remember this when you get to that. And that's why it was written, that's why I would place it closer to, this was happening in the 470s BC. I'd place it time-wise in with Ezra and Nehemiah in the 420s BC. And therefore, I think it's more likely that Ezra wrote it. Okay, y'all can listen now. So, now we get to the climax of the story, which is what does the king think of Esther? Now, remember that she'd been provided not only the extra preparations, but through the sage advice of Haggai, what to take with her when she went to the king. He knows exactly what the king likes. Haggai wants him to choose Esther. He likes her. He is doing everything he can to put her in a position to be chosen. And she wisely goes along with that. Okay? Those are her options. Okay? I know that's very ugly when we think about what is happening, but those were her options. Now we get to the climax. That is, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So of all the women selected, he liked her best. And that is what was in question. So that's now been resolved. That is the climax of the story. And so you get the two things here that are part of this. Xerxes makes the choice, and Esther receives favor as a result of that. So what happens as a result of what has been done? Okay, she's been selected, so now we have to go through the formal process. The king likes her, so now she's going to be made queen. That is simplified here, that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. That would have actually happened, not just like here we are that day and in a private ceremony. No, this would have implied a ceremony later on for everyone to know that here she is and that she has been selected and she is then queen. Now, from all you have in here, within this, you have the symbolism here involved of a crown. That's important, okay, because that indicates something about power and prominence. There is the choice that she is queen, but the context is Vashti, what had happened. So all of those three things have been leading up to this have come down to this situation. Remember what he's trying to show is all the things that have to be in place for what's going to happen later. For Esther to be in a position, so he had to start here for us to appreciate what it took for someone to be in a position of government close to the king in the first place, to have any kind of influence. That was essential to show how that worked, which we'll come back to that at the end. So in verse 18, remind you, the king made a great feast. And again, we pointed out, we had feast in chapter 1, we had feast here in chapter 2. We're going to have feast in almost every chapter, okay? It's throughout all of this. And notice we again have the officials and servants involved, and we have a holiday in the provinces, and gave gifts according to the generosity of the king. Okay, I want you to note that, because that idea is going to come up again at the end of the book in a very different context. Okay, so he's laying all this out as we get through, that there are all these little things that are kind of in place and are patterns that he's wanting us to understand. So you end up with how you're going to feel about this is a feast, the officials return, you've got a holiday that's proclaimed, and the giving of gifts. And all of those things are pertinent to what's going to happen later on. Chris? Holiday remitted for that day? Well, that would have, the nature of a holiday then would be kind of, showing how great I am, and therefore you won't have to do anything.
Connecting back to your point about
The money spent. Yes, that would have been a big deal. Money is going to play a role throughout as well. All right, now we're going to see what we can do here. It's a short story that ends through in this chapter 2. It's a really important story, which is, you'd think we've got all the information we really need. But we actually need this little bit of information. And that's why these 2 chapters form the exposition of the book as a whole. It is laying out all the pertinent information about the disposition, the nature of the king and the problems that were going on in the kingdom, the selection of Esther, and that's going to be, that puts her in that situation where that's going to be important later on. But there has to be this other little thing that's important for the story about Mordecai. So that brings us to verses 19 through 23, and I labeled this one a plot about a plot, okay, which when we read it, you'll see. You have here, in short form, you've got 2 verses of exposition, a verse of rising action, very short and unusual. It's followed up with a verse that's dealing with the climax, and then the last verse, what comes as a result of this and how you're going to feel about it. So we'll see that in very short order. But in the process of this story, you end up with Esther, who is an orphan in the last story. And I don't know if I probably didn't specify it, I did on the slide, but did you see that Esther's story was a rags to riches story? She's an orphan that ends up as queen. That's a classic rags to riches story. Okay, so now we have, I call it the plot about a plot. You've got Esther, who is innocent in all of this. She's just there trying to help out and mind her own business. Mordecai is the hero of this story, and that's going to be important for later on. Xerxes is the ruler who doesn't know what's going on, and then you have Bigvan and Teresh, who are the rebels because they're upset at the king and want to kill him. So let's go ahead and read this little story. When virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai sat within the king's gate. Now Esther had not revealed her family and her people, just as Mordecai had charged her, for Esther obeyed the command of Mordecai as when she was brought up by him. That's also important for our story. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, who told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. And when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on the gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right, so this is, I would say, an overcoming the monster type of plot. You've got a big evil problem, and that has to be addressed. So you have, in just these few verses, you have the exposition, which is, for everybody else, life essentially returns to normal. Now, this is, he notes the time and it was done in regard to the second time when the virgins were brought together, okay? So while this is all going on. So that's a simultaneous time that this is happening this second time. Esther's now been elevated, and that you've got this whole kind of thing going on where she has access in some way. Mordecai sits at the king's gate. That placement, again, the second time, being at the king's gate is going to be very important. That becomes kind of where he just lives. He just stays there and is taking care of business there. He's not allowed inside, but he's as close as he can get. And that puts him into a good position for whatever else was going on. Okay. You then have the rising action, which is you've got this plot going on. So you did note again that Esther hasn't revealed anything about herself. So she's still keeping quiet, and she's emphasized that she does what Mordecai tells her to do. This is again foreshadowing of a situation where she's going to be relaying information. But in 21, it tells us about this plot that these two guys, the doorkeepers, they're sitting there talking about how they're going to get the king. Well, from the point of view of what you have with Mordecai, he's at the right place at the right time. They think they're safe away from anybody who would care anything about what's going on with the king. But instead, Mordecai is there to hear it and is therefore able to relay that information. So when he hears about it and reports that plot, and all this is very quickly, he's telling you, he hears it, he reports it to Esther, who passes that information along. That's a chain that we're going to see repeated again later on in the book. Okay? That's what's happened here. So what happens as a result of that? The story is confirmed. Okay? So we've got the information. What do we do with this? They go and they check out the story. The story is right, and the conspirators are hanged. Now, when we say hanged, what do we think they did with them? You put a public execution rope around their neck and, right? Probably not. The emphasis, they could have been actually, there are multiple ways to see this. They could have been killed first. Hanged actually referred more to the public display that was put up to warn everybody else up. So the thing that maybe you could see if you say, well, see, I'm looking at my crowd and wondering, that was actually done in more close to modern times. You see that in Pirates of the Caribbean when you got them pirates beware kind of stuff going on. Don't you want to end up like this? Well, they did the same thing, but it was more that they would put your body, and we're not sure exactly whether or not you were killed in the morning, and this happened later, or sometimes it happened, this is how they killed you, is there'd be a large stake, and they would take you and put you on the stake. Okay? A little bit gruesome, but that was part of it. Brock? Yeah, because the nature of the word is wood, and that we run into the same thing in Greek actually, is that, and they use those, remember it says, "Accursed everyone who is hanged on a tree for Christ." So the whole idea of some kind of wooden object is what it's dealing with. So you're put on there and put on display. That's what was happened to them. That's also foreshadowing, that's going to come up again later. That you're introduced, this is what they do to people. And then at the end it is, put it on the records. Okay? You need to write this down. And it was written down, here's what they did, but also write down what Mordecai did to prevent this. This was really important as far as an event in a king's reign, that he was saved from being, killed. That was important kind of stuff. And it's going to prove very important in the future of this book. So what we have now already established between these three stories, okay, we've seen the story in chapter 1 that involves how Vashti created this problem mainly because of the pride and everything of Ahasuerus. And that she then is deposed, and that creates this opening. The timing of it with the war and the problems historically we know that happened as a result of that. We come back then and we get a picture of this king who, number one, listens to advisors pretty quickly. It tends to operate based upon and make decisions emotionally. And that as a result he can be manipulated. Okay? All of this we've already learned this in these first 2 chapters. Okay? So he can be manipulated. He gets his problem. He just wants someone to solve his problem for him. We have now introduced to us Mordecai, who has shown character in taking on his orphaned niece, taking that cousin, whatever, got a relationship. He's taking care of her. But she's pulled into this whole kind of overall thing because she's so pretty. And now he's got to find a way in giving her advice. This is important. You see that he gave her advice, it's emphasized twice, before she was taken in. It's kind of like, okay, here are the last minute things to remember. So the things she was doing and how she was behaving inside, once she left Mordecai, that Haggai responded to, we know that Mordecai had given her advice. She is then elevated, recognized first for who she is as a person valued by Haggai. We work through the process. She's now put in this situation because the king likes her, again because of these other events, likes her. She's made queen, which gives her greater access to the king. We have all the things in place about the feasts, about the nature of these advisors, and about now, in this last story, we see that Mordecai has proven his loyalty on the side, that there is a means of communication between Mordecai and Esther that's implied, not directly stated, but implied. That Esther, at least in this case, was able to fairly quickly get information to the king. It's early on, again, after she was selected, that makes more sense from what we're going to see, that contrast later on. It's not as easy later on to have the same kind of access. She's got the access, and we have all of these things now. So there's been provision. The king has been saved. That's big and important. It was written down, but quickly forgotten. That's kind of who he is, right? All about the moment, but not really an introspective type of leader, I think we can safely say. So what has happened is everything now is in place for actually the big reason why this book was written. And what I want you to appreciate is how every single little item has been laid out in the exposition. All the information we need to know about Mordecai that's going to come in later, gives good advice, comes to the defense, loyal. All we need to know about the king and how he responds and how he can shift his loyalty and how he'll listen to advice, how much he depends on advisors, that's really important. And that makes him very mercurial. Okay? Esther, that she listens to Mordecai still. She's very loyal to him. And so there's now this proximity. There is loyalty. There is the problem actually exists within the king himself and how he can be manipulated. And all of this is set up for what's going to happen next when we get introduced to the real tension that's going to happen in chapter 3. Now, I hope that in going through this, I've whetted your appetite. This is a really exciting story. However, I'm not going to be here next week because I'm speaking at PTP. But that's not that wrong. That's not that long, right? However, the following week, I've asked Hayden Baker to give a report on his trip to India and Nepal during this class time. I think that will be well worth your while to be here for, too. Next week, Kevin Kogas is going to take the class. After that week, then the following, Hayden will do it, and then we will return and we'll come to chapter 3. It's actually a very good place for to stop. We've gotten through the exposition. Y'all can think about it, come up with your own theories and ideas. That's great. And we will then pick off there. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes because you didn't have that at the beginning of class. So you're dismissed.